Good morning and a warm welcome to all of you joining us online today. My name is Zafer Meshe, and on behalf of SETA Berlin, it's my pleasure to host this web panel with the title EU-Türkiye Economic Relations at Crossroads, Interdependence, Asymmetries, and the Case for Strategic Re-engagement. A few words on format before we begin. Our session will run for about 1 hour. Professor Yalçın will open with a presentation of roughly 25 minutes or less, after which we will move into a moderated discussion. You are welcome to submit questions through the chat throughout, and we will turn to a selection of them toward the end. Let me set the scene. The economic relationship between the European Union and Turkey rests on one of the oldest and deepest pieces of integration architecture the Union has built with any non-member state, the Customs Union of 1995. For 3 decades, it has bound Turkish and European industry together through dense value chains and a striking degree of mutual dependence. The European single market remains by a clear margin Turkey's most important economic partner, and Turkey in turn has become an increasingly significant industrial hinterland for European companies. And this relationship now sits at a genuine crossroads. The architecture that once drove convergence is showing its age. A transformed European economic model built around the green and digital transition, around economic security and de-risking, and around a new generation of free trade agreements has exposed structural asymmetries that the 1995 framework was never designed to handle. At the same time, the geopolitical shifts of recent years have reopened an older question, whether Europe and Turkey in fact need one another more, not less. The question before us this morning is not whether interdependence exists. It plainly does. Question is on what terms it should be governed from here. Is the case for strategic re-engagement compelling? And if it is, what would a modernized partnership actually look like? To help us think this through, we could not have a better guide. Therefore, it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Dr. Erdal Yalçın. Please let me introduce our guest speaker. Erdal Yalçın is Professor of International Economics at the University of Applied Sciences, Constance. Previously, he was the Deputy Director of the prestigious IFO Center for International Economics, which is called IFO Institute in Munich. IFO Institute is one of 7 economic institutes advising German government on economic affairs. He holds a doctoral degree in economics from Tübingen University for his thesis on the role of uncertainty in export and foreign direct investment decisions. Amongst others, he analyzed the potential long-term welfare effects of the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, this famous TTIP, and the economic consequences of a deepened customs union between the EU and Turkey. His current research topics include the impact of an EU-Mercosur trade accord on the German economy, the consequences of US protectionism, and the EU Commission's proposal for a new anti-dumping methodology. A major share of his policy and academic work deals with the question how international trade finance interact in light of uncertainty. He has published numerous articles policy reports in the field of international economics. He is regular consultant to various European institutions and ministries. He is a research fellow of CE's EFO, which is a part of EFO network in Munich. Professor Yalçın, we are delighted to have you with us. The floor is yours for the keynote presentation.
Dear Zafer Meshe, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure to speak here together on the platform of SETA in these times. The topic you already set a very nice umbrella and the stage. I named it the EU-Türkiye economic relations at Crossroads, and I think it is essential to look a bit back in history to understand what we need today. So I want to give a short overview of the economic developments on the one side, briefly how Turkey developed over the last 3 decades, then briefly the relevance of the European Customs Union with Turkey, and then also we need to bring in the political dimension. How did the integration and policies developed over the last 3 decades, and what should be adjusted? What are the challenges in the search for an appropriate renewed EU-Türkiye relations that started recently, I believe, also with a very constructive visit by the Turkish foreign minister in Germany. Now, let me start first with Turkey's developments. When we look back over the last 50 years, here I brought a little graph with some indicators, and you don't see much on the first side. It's a timeline starting in 1974, and the only thing that is, visible on the graph is this green line, which is the Turkey's development of the inflation rate. And as you can nicely see, starting in the 70s, moving towards the 90s, Turkey was again and again in periods of high inflation, reflecting the very challenging situation of any Turkish government with respect to macroeconomic developments in the country. However, and you can also see accompanied by a high inflation rate going up to 80% in the 90s, there is a very low level of investment in Turkey in this period, foreign direct investment or portfolio investment. In 1994, however, Turkey is then signing a very important agreement with the European Economic Community at that time, which is the trade agreement, the Customs Union Agreement, opening the stage for Turkish and European companies to start to build an interconnected value chain network. And the effect of this agreement is tremendous. You can see it here, how dramatically the picture changes, not immediately, of course, in the year 1995 or 96, because even so the agreement in 1995, the Customs Union Agreement was signed, it is the political stability that specifically appears on the agenda in the year 2002 with the election of the AKP, the AK Party in Turkey. And you can see in the late 90s, already with the customs union and the negotiations that start to take place, the inflation rate starts to drop. And with the new stabilization and the political agenda of the new Turkish government in the year 2002, it is a skyrocketing economic change that Turkey experiences. This picture is very stable until 2015, 2016. There are turmoils, difficulties still in the years 2007, 8 starting, but they are not reflected immediately in the economic relationships. You can see there's a strong drop in investments indicated by the bars between 2017 and 2020, but this picture again stabilizes after 21, 22 when the corona crisis disappears, and also the relations on a different level between Turkey and the European Union start to stabilize again. Now, as I mentioned, as you indicated, one important element of this positive developments with all these challenges in between is the customs union that has organized how trade and investment should take place between the two countries and regions. And one major argument you can bring up and take out from this development is, besides the contract, the agreement, it has been always important that there was a credible and mutual credibility between the relationship. And this is reflected in political stability and a successful cooperation. And the successful cooperation automatically opened the door for economic success. How does this economic success look like? Here I brought you the overall development of Turkey's exports, aggregate exports over the last 30 years. And you can nicely see after the 90s, in the early 2000s and in the succeeding years, the European Union has become the most important export market for Turkish firms. Today, around 41% of Turkey's exports go to the European Union. And more importantly, it is a not equal distribution of exports. There are different countries that take different roles. Germany is the most important partner, stable at around 8% of all trade exports going out from Turkey. On the other hand, if we go watch the import side, Turkey is also importing and is interconnected with the European Union, but Turkey is a hub for intermediate goods, and this explains why, besides imports from Europe, also imports from the world, specifically countries like China or Russia with raw materials, are so important. So Turkey takes a role as a production location for European companies. It also is important that Turkey has the need to have good relations, trade relations with the rest of the world in this framing. Now, coming back briefly, Europe is important when it comes to an export relationship from Turkey's perspective. But here on this map, I show you the ready numbers for the year 2024. The numbers of exports differ significantly across the different countries, not only because of the size, but also because of the distribution of companies and relevance of companies in different industries. Germany, with 27 billion euros in 24, is the most important country. And interestingly, you can see one would expect that France, as the second biggest economy, should take the second biggest position. But it's not France, it is Italy that is much more important, given the cooperative and mutual treatment also on the political level, which is reflected immediately in the trade relationship. On the import side, the picture is very similar. Germany is very important, followed by the UK, which is no longer a member of the European Union, but still economically well connected with Turkey, followed by Italy. Now, so this could be, deepened much more, but the punchline is very clear. Economically, Turkey is deeply part of the European economic community. Now, when it comes to the political sphere, I brought here, consider the developments of the Turkey-EU relations in three phases. We had a very constructive, productive period in the years between 1996 and 2006, where Europe treated Turkey on an equal footage, on the level of cooperation. And I remember talking to Günther Verheugen, who was responsible commissioner for the expansion of the European Union, when he was explaining that it's no problem to just pick up the phone and call the Turkish prime minister and just settle any dispute. So this is also reflected in the economic graph, which I showed you. So in the early 2000s, economic success was accompanied by a very reliable, predictable policy. This is changing. It starts to change in the year 2006, 2007, and it's not very diplomatic maybe, but there is one name that is definitely also responsible for this shift in the relationship. It is the French president who starts to communicate that Turkey cannot be part of the European Union. And this rhetoric and this political stance is also then expanding in some other countries, making the cooperation between the European Union and Turkey much more difficult. This is then accompanied with a global environment where, for example, in Germany, relations with Russia at that moment are very positive. The German business model becomes a model where we buy cheap energy from Russia and start to export sophisticated machinery products or automotives to the world. And the economic growth success in Germany is very nice. So the need for Germany and other European countries to identify the role Turkey has in this period is not obvious, because everything seems to be working. Security issues, energy issues are not on the agenda. This picture, unfortunately, creates, of course, also reactions in Turkey. And in contrast to European countries, Turkey is in an environment which is, this can be described by conflicts. We have Northern Africa, Syria, Iran, all these migration issues, which are all on the agenda only on Turkey or on a large scale to handle with military conflicts in particular. So in light of this change in these three phases, from positive to stagnation to divergence, we can take out one important message. How can we come back to this already experienced positive integration agenda? And this agenda was characterized by domestic reforms in Turkey, positively aligning its policy with the European Union, and also a European Union that considered itself as an anchor to support the Turkish government in establishing European policies that are complying with European expectation and standards. So, and at the same time, and that's a major difference, the external environment in that period was very positive. You know, global growth, liquidity, low interest rates. This has changed, and the conditions are different. So we cannot simply say what we have done in the past can be today. So what are the challenges today? The last important aspect, if we talk about this relationship, is we need to bear in mind the world has changed compared to the year 2000 to 2005. Here I brought you an indicator measuring how the perception of policy uncertainty in the world is changing. And you can see that people and politicians declare that the world has become increasingly unpredictable. This is not only a general perception. I also showed you here two maps for the year 2005 and 2025, where we measure for countries how people perceive uncertainty. And you can see that the whole world has become darker. People consider the world to be much more uncertain. It is much more difficult to make decisions, to plan what is going to happen tomorrow. Now, the reasons for this are obvious. We have a completely changed geopolitical situation with real conflicts, the war, several wars in the world. We have also a fundamental change in global supply chains after experiencing the dependencies during Corona and how difficult it can be to rely on faraway locations like China or India, for example. We have also a big topic on security issues affecting many fields, just to name one, energy security, for example, to guarantee a working economic environment. Now, from individual perspectives, there are also national challenges. Here I brought you Turkey. Turkey, despite the political difficult challenges in its neighborhood, it has also domestic challenges. The Turkish lira here, for example, as you can see, had a rather low inflation until the year 2018, 2019. And with Corona and with the global twist, and also with the domestic challenges the country experienced, the inflation and the Turkish lira are now massively under pressure. People experience that. The Turkish lira is losing dramatically in value, putting the government, of course, under pressure to tackle this issue. But then there are, issues where Turkey has no control of. One of these big problems is the outdated structure of the customs union. Here I brought you the example of the customs union, and the problem I want to point on is the European Union, for example, has signed a new free trade agreement with Vietnam. and also with other countries like with South America, Mercosur, or with India. The problem for Turkey is not member in the decision process and in the negotiation process of new free trade agreements. So when Vietnam now has an agreement with the European Union, it has an access to the European market, but because Turkey is member of the customs union, it also has to open its market for Vietnamese cheap products. That would not be a problem if Turkey at the same time has a equivalent easier market access to Vietnam. But this is not the case because Turkey is not member of the European Union. And this is not a Vietnam specific problem, it's a customs union specific problem. And that is I call this the asymmetry problem, which has to be solved in times where the European Union is negotiating many free trade agreements. But this is only one political and institutional problem. There are other, in a changing world, the European Union has started to shift from a liberal market policy towards a public policy driven system. What does this mean? It means, for example, we have an initiative that is called IPCEI, standing for important projects of common European interest. That means companies located in European Union countries will receive special support subsidies. But because Turkey is out of this system, it is not part of this program that will trigger a lot of money for new industries. The same is true for, I'm not going to name all of these. I just list this as an example on the slides. But for example, the raw materials and defense legislation is changing, meaning companies that receive subsidies and support from the government are also restricted to the geographic region of the European Union. But the Turkish companies that are de facto part of these value chains, even so they are already contributing to the European companies, are not part of this industrial policy. Now, this reflects with what I call the dilemma between having a country, Turkey, deeply integrated into the economic and security architecture of the European Union, but it is not part of the decision process and new legislation in the European Union. Where do we observe this dilemma? We observe it, I showed it in the customs union itself with this asymmetry problem with Vietnam and Mercosur. We see it in the consultation when the European Union is negotiating new rules, for example, for the Green Deal or the carbon border adjustment. Turkey is confronted with decisions, but not part of this system. So that is creating severe problems, not only for Turkey, but also for the way how these partners can progress efficiently together. So where can we start? And can we predict that a change in these areas can be supported? I brought here one area which we have analyzed for years. It's again the customs union, which is the economic element of this bilateral relationship. And already in the year 2015, the European Union and Turkey already organized a modernization. There is already a roadmap how this can be achieved. And if the European Union were implementing these modernizations, I brought you some numbers. The prediction is that trade over a time window of 10 years would increase by about 40% with almost every partner in exports and imports. So this is an annual acceleration growth rate of bilateral trade of 4 to 5%. So, which is a significant number. It would be the growth rate of the period between 2002 to 2006, for example. Now, the punchline of my presentation is we have an experience between Turkey and the European Union that if there is an agenda of treating each other with trust and on a level playing field, a positive agenda will translate into very positive economic effects. The economic framework is already there. Turkey is part of the European value chain structure. Turkey is part of important industries in the machinery industry, in the automotive industry, in the increasingly defense industry. So we need a new framework that maybe is not immediately, again, an ambitious discussion about full membership, but a step-by-step solution to have a partnership of equals, as I call it. So I wrote an article. You can download this on the webpage eConstans, where you can read the details about these numbers for those who are interested in. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dito. Thank you, Professor Yalçın. Thank you. Really, that was a remarkably clear map of a complex relationship, I would say. You have given us the full arc from Turkey's economic development through the workings and the limits of the customs union to a concrete agenda for renewal. I would like to spend the time we have left pressing on a few of these threads, I would say. And in order not to waste the time, let me ask several questions on what you presented, and so that we can little bit in some dimensions deeper dive in, you know. And let me start then with the question. I mean, according to what you said, Professor Yalçın, you described the present EU-Türkiye relationship as defined by what you call an interdependence dilemma, which is really one of the critical aspects, of course. A framework sufficiently deep to generate mutual dependence, but too incomplete to govern it effectively. You know, that's crazy. Could you set this scene for our audience by explaining what you mean by this dilemma and why, in your view, it has become more rather than less consequential over time?
Yeah, this is, I think, the most important aspect. Indeed, we should communicate. What I mean with the interdependence dilemma is that the EU and Turkey are economically deeply connected. There is no doubt about this. Yeah? If I talk to companies today, like I live in the south of Germany, and I was on a larger association meeting of an industrial association in South Germany. Every company that was present there has a partner company in Turkey, in the chemical industry, in the machine, there's no exception. So this is already an established network. And the problem is the institutional relationship, meaning if you introduce a law in Germany, in the European Union, is not taking this connectivity into account. How is it not going to take into account? Turkey is not part of the negotiation and framing process of new laws and rules. Now, so in other words, the customs union has created
standards and norms, etc., as well.
Standards, regulations, environmental issues, which are of course very heavily on the agenda. So I will give you a list of topics, but the customs union has created a strong trade integration, dense supply, mutual dependence. That's the term, mutual dependence in key sectors. But Turkey is not, that doesn't mean that Turkey is simply only a trading partner. Turkey is part of the process where when something changes in the process, Turkey should be part in adjusting the process. So the problem is that this institutional adjustment has not followed the economic integration. And there are many regulations. So I mentioned in the presentation the IPCEI, the important project for common European interest, but there is the Net Zero Industry Act, for example, meaning there are many regional projects where companies are forced by law to reduce their emissions. At the same time, they receive a lot of support by the government. Then there is money allocated to improve the resilience of the European production structure. I said Turkey is part of the European production structure, but it's not part of this money that is streamed into the industries. We have the Industrial Accelerator Act, where new technologies, artificial intelligence, new energy, and so forth is subsidized by the government, but it is so far not regulated how Turkey, as part of these important industries, should participate in this institutional adjustment. So in simple words, Turkey's influence is limited in forming these new and important roles for the joint value chains. And the lack of this modernization of the framework creates, of course, tensions. It is not granted that the Turkish companies can solve this on a bilateral micro level. You need, at a certain stage, there are rules that will prohibit an efficient cooperation. And the last point, you asked me why this is, not changing over time. The reason is, initially, the idea was, after the customs union, Turkey will increasingly be integrated into the European Union. And one day, when it is member of the European Union, this dilemma will be not existent, because as a member of the European Union, you automatically participate in the decision process. But that's not the case. And actually, it is the European Union that started, some member states that started this rhetoric that Turkey should not become a full member, but never presented a solution how to integrate such a critical and important partner into the decision process. So, and since 2006-7, with this negative attitude of France in particular, we are stuck into this progress in economic developments, but backward stepping in rule-based cooperation to solve the technical and the legal problems companies are facing in between the two partners.
Right. Well, another topic in your analysis, the years from 2002 to 2007 mark the high point of EU-Türkiye economic convergence. What, in your view, were the decisive ingredients of that convergence? And how much of it was genuinely driven by the accession process, functioning as a credibility anchor, as opposed to favorable domestic reform dynamics or a permissive international environment?
So this is also a very good question. In my view, it's not only one aspect that basically can describe this very, very successful period of EU-Türkiye relationships. So in the year between 2002 and 2007, there are several convergence supporting elements. The first one was within Turkey. Turkey at that time went through a period of macroeconomic stabilization and strong reforms after a huge economic crisis. Many people don't remember that Turkey basically, there was a huge earthquake that put Turkey under huge challenges, and the political situation was no stability, permanent changing governments, high inflation. So this is almost a quarter of a century back, and people don't remember. So there was already high inflation environment. Public finance suddenly, with a stable government, started to stabilize, reliable. Inflation dropped, as I showed you. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. And predictability started. So Turkey itself became very predictable. That's the first important pillar. The second aspect was the European accession process. The process itself already created a credibility that both sides will converge and jointly work together. And this signal allowed the Turkish government also to push through difficult reforms. If we talk about Europe as an anchor, it simply means that the Turkish governments can basically, it's a carrot to convince sometimes people what comes after the pain of reforms. So this can be seen in the competition policy, public administration, and also the European standards in the industries, that all were moving towards the European Union standard. That's the second important element. The third one was that we had already the customs union from 1995-96, but with the stabilization of this domestic situation in Turkey and the improved relationship with the European Union, the customs union could start to work effectively. That means it is not only the agreement that was available, it was the implementation of the agreement by the government and by cooperation and by domestic reforms. And last but not least, and this is very important, at that time, these three elements were easier to handle because the environment surrounding Turkey and the European Union was very positive. Macroeconomically, very low interest rates, international investors were looking for good investment opportunities. Turkey was a perfect place. Turkey received in 1 year, to give you a number, in the year 2003, Turkey received as much investment as in 20 years before, in 1 year, just to give you the dimension of available investments at that period. So globally, you remember maybe the foreign minister at that time was talking about a relationship with all neighbors in a positive manner because there were no conflicts. The same spirit was in Europe. The relations with Russia were improving. The relations with the Mediterranean countries were improving. So it was very easy to communicate positive political agendas at that time. So to sum up and to answer your question, in my view, it is not simply this accession process that created these positive developments. The accession process combined with domestic reforms in Turkey, an equal level playing field where European and Turkish political environment globally supported the convergence between Turkey and the European Union. This today, I believe we have to bear in mind the situation is different. That in particular, that Turkey on the eastern margin of the European Union has much different confrontations, challenges than, let's say, a country like France. French politicians don't have to deal with questions of security, possible rockets that can arrive from Iran, war problems still in this region of northern Syria. So it's mapping European perspectives on a Turkish foreign policy and economic environment is no longer possible. So it's important to understand that when we talk about solutions between the two regions, we need to bear in mind Turkey today needs a different flexibility compared to the years 2002 to 2006-07.
Thank you, Professor Dalyalçın. When we look at the period of stagnation and divergence, 2007 to up to 2022, you describe the period between this time as one of stagnation and divergence, which trade flows and supply chain integration continued to deepen while the political and institutional framework eroded. How do you weigh the relative responsibility of developments in Turkey on the one hand and shifts within the European Union on the other in producing that outcome?
Yeah, this is, I think, again, we can learn something from the historical perspective here. One important aspect is, and that's the reason why I'm very blunt in expressing this, in the year 2006-07, the EU accession process lost credibility when politicians, one famous name is Nicolas Sarkozy, but also other politicians openly stated, for whatever reason, it was not really clear at that moment, Turkey cannot become a full member. Even so, the country was implementing reforms, converging the European Union. And today we know the European Union was confronted with domestic problems. There was this huge enlargement fatigue after taking in 10 countries. The political resistance in countries like France, where structural problems, high youth unemployment, problems with the population of former colony members that lived in France and not integrated into the country, and all these topics. Then on the other hand, the Cyprus issue, while in the previous period, in the positive years of 2002 to 2006, Europe and Turkey both together tried to increase positive pressure to unite the island, suddenly Europe started to instrumentalize Cyprus as a problem for Turkey's convergence to the European Union. And this type of political stance in Europe created mistrust, destroyed trust, destroyed cooperation, and weakened also the capacity in those countries who were still trying to push forward mutual convergence between the two countries. Of course, there were also developments in the Turkey which have to be criticized. You know, we had domestic developments where the reforms and changes created also resistance in Turkey. Like I mentioned, the demonstrations in Istanbul, the Gezi Park protests, the institutional weakenings that you find in international rankings, obviously where Turkey is challenged with corruption issues reflected in imprisonment and so forth. And unfortunately, when national developments, both on the Turkish side and on the European side, developed in such a negative manner, this also created a divergence between the two regions. Although there was basically still the possibility, I think, to continue on a positive agenda. I describe this phrase for this reason as a stagnation, because there was no longer a force in Europe and also in Turkey to stay together and say, like, we need to focus on what we can do together. The problem was politicians started to communicate more domestic problems combined with the fatigue of enlargement in the European Union, and we lost this positive anchor argument of the European Union for all the reasons I just briefly mentioned.
Thank you, Professor Yalçın. You know, was the period as well critical times with the military coup, etc. You know, it has indeed also, I would say, created from a broad perspective that the government is crashing demonstrations, etc. here and there. Of course, it happened somehow, but it was existential threats which has been, of course, with the Fethu and the Gülenists initiator of this military coup was a trauma in Turkey. You know, it's we discussed several times about it, and this kind of aspects, critical developments, shapes, of course, the people, you know? And that's also important to mention. That's why I mentioned it. Now, another question is, which is, I would say, a constructive one, you know, how to manage the structural asymmetries, you know, this is the issue. And a central analytical move in your paper is the distinction between manageable asymmetries, such as those generated by the CBAM mechanism, CBA mechanism, better says, which can in principle be mitigated through regulatory alignment, and structural asymmetries arising from the European Union's internal policy architecture, such as important projects of common European interest, you mentioned already, or territorial subsidy frameworks, which Turkey cannot resolve through domestic adaptation alone. Could you, for example, could you walk us through this distinction and explain why you regard it as critical, decisive for the reform debate?
Yeah, so this distinction between
Yes.
manageable and structural asymmetries is central in this current situation, because let me maybe first we need to make the audience maybe bring on the same level. What is manageable asymmetry? So you already defined it correctly in my view. There are issues where Turkey, independently of the European Union decision process, still is able to domestically, with its own legislation, to handle it. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a good example for this. What is the carbon border adjustment mechanism? It means if German companies, for example, import steel from outside of the European Union, then you need now to declare how much carbon is contained in the imported product, and there's a reference, and if it is higher than the European reference, then there will be a taxation in order to protect clean production in the European Union. So, and as we mentioned,
Trump.
it sounds a bit like the US, but it's different. The mechanism tries to be fair. When you sell clean products, you should not harm those who are dumping cheap or emission intensive product. That's the idea of the European system, like supporting green technologies by making dirty products more expensive. This is the idea. But now we already know Turkish companies are already in this networks of European Union production chains. But this regulation is again a European regulation. But it is not a big deal. It is manageable, because Turkey easily can adapt regulations where German and French and Italian companies in Turkey, located in Turkey, can then handle this problem, measuring, declaring, adapting. And Turkey is, by the way, very good in terms of green energy. When it comes to solar energy, for example, companies have to, when they build new facilities, have to take care of a certain amount of green energy as part of their energy mix. So Turkey managed already and was forward-looking. But then there are structural asymmetries. And the easiest way to understand this is the free trade initiatives of the European Union. The European Union has signed a free trade agreement with the largest population in the world, India. Now, that means Indian producers now will start to export a lot of goods to Europe, including Turkey, because Turkey is part of the customs union. Yeah, that means tariffs will drop for India, and tariff policy is something Turkey cannot set on its own. Because it is member of the customs union, Turkey gave the control of its trade policy to Brussels. But Turkey did not do this just because of friendship or gentleman's agreement. Turkey did it because the idea was, in the short run of 5 to 6 years after 1996, Turkey will become part of defending its interests in rule shaping, in setting regulations, being part of the European Union in the best case. And if not, that's also people don't know, most people, when I talk to them at least, there is an association council, it's called an association council, where Turkey, with the EU member states representatives, can actually create legislation which can defend Turkish interests within this asymmetric situation Turkey is in. But unfortunately, the council is not working. It is not activated for many reasons, which we cannot deepen for time reasons. So there are, and all these new industry policies, security related policies in the European Union are structural policies where Turkey is not part of it. And the big question is, how can Turkey, as an important element in the European Union, be brought into the decision process without being a full member? That is the critical question.
Yeah. I mean, how can this legislation entity can be activated where Turkey and the counterparts in the European Union can discuss especially this issue, because this is very critical to become integrated into overseeing or designing standards, norms, etc. This is it's critical, you know. Otherwise, when something changes in modalities, in norms, etc. So the Turkish partner in Istanbul or in Diyarbakir also, they have to look after it, to catch it, and then to try to implement it without not a direct guidance. You know, this is it's really crazy. You know, that's amazing.
So absolutely, that's the reason why it's a dilemma. Unfortunately, everybody who is in the field knows we have to find solutions, and I think for me, I have been dealing with this for more than 10 years, specifically with these problems. There are let's say low-hanging fruits and challenging areas. And we need to start with the low-hanging fruits. And as we did, by the way, historically. So let's start with a customs union. So if the European Union is serious and wants to progress with Turkey, then one should not bring in complicated additional topics when it comes to the modernization of the customs union. What I mean with this is, for example, it is not very constructive to talk about the reunification of Cyprus as a condition for a modernization of the customs union. That will not make the life of the negotiators easier. So the other way should be the progress. This progress should be, we have a framework, we know how to solve the customs union modernization. Let's start to work on it and create security. Then one should prohibit politicization of difficult topics. I want to give a very, very simple example. There is this unnecessary conflict in the Aegean when it comes to territorial disputes with the 7 miles and 12 miles when it comes to resources and so forth. So it is not very constructive if individual politicians from Europe, specifically France, appear in Greece and start to talk about defense and protection interests, while there is also a very normal, natural way that neighbors come together and try to find constructive solutions, and not bound to whether other areas, like again the customs union, should be modernized or not. So my concern is that, in contrast to the year 2002 to 2006, given the massive challenges Europe and Turkey face, the whole world faces, we have to prohibit that politicians start to disturb specific areas of interest for the sake of national interest, as we observed in the destructive period. So, and I have a hope. The Turkish foreign minister, Mr. Fizan, was in Germany. That was the images everybody was hoping for. Very warm welcome by the German foreign minister. The consultations have started after 12 years. Germany has, in particular, Germany is as the most important economic partner of Turkey, and Turkey as a very important partner of Germany, culturally, economically, historically, can create this environment. And Germany, the German leadership, I'm convinced, can also pave the way to focus on constructive areas. Like, let's start with the economic area where we have already the solution. Let's not start to bring in Cyprus, the Greek Aegean matters. Let's think about together to improve the defense industry, to improve new industries, the artificial industry, the energy sector role of Turkey in light of what is going on in the Gulf region, Turkey as a security hub, a buffer zone. So, to wrap it up, we as academics, we can only point on this. Let's not fall back into divergence. Let's solve dilemmas by stepwise solutions, like modernizing the customs union, which can be a huge signal, and it is a necessary signal, in my opinion.
Well, right. I mean, it is obviously clear that the Greek Cyprus part has leverage, on the European Union with its veto power. So that means in order to not only the Cyprus case, but in order that European Union can act by interest of the majority of the member states, that they have to really must reform the way they are voting. That's a very critical issue. The other issue is we talked about the manageable part of this dilemma, and I think the problem with the free trade area, free trade agreements, especially with India, is a big problem, I would say, because Turkey is siding next to Pakistan in terms of security, and their brother states since a long time. And if Turkey will approach India on that issue, then they will ask for compromises for whatsoever. So Turkey will be not into that, and that means that Turkey has not the same right as India, as you described, for the entering the market of the counterpart, and this is an issue as well. But for the other countries, for Mercosur or Vietnam or South Korea or Japan, I don't know. So this is it makes it also manageable to have an FTA with these countries. So this kind of can also be part of the manageable aspect, as you also mentioned somehow also in a discussion last time on the telephone, I think. So this is an issue, and I have maybe the final question, a closing question for you, Erdal. It looks it's for the perspective, if you had to name the single most important decision each side should take in the next 12 months to put this relationship on a more constructive footing, what would it be?
That's a very difficult question. I know when the politicians need to decide on this. My hope is that, and I didn't show it today, but I want to mention it at the very end. In 1963, when the Ankara Agreement was signed, this is the bigger frame. It was a German president of the Commission of the European Economic Community, Walter Peter Hallstein. It was a German who gave the speech in Ankara, and he said, Turkey is part of the European Union, and we need to build on this spirit. And in the next 12 months, we need a credible sign. And I'm convinced that when politicians in Turkey and Europe come together and say, we start to implement a modernization of the customs union, because we believe on a long-term relationship. Otherwise, it would be that Turkey has to switch this framework. It has to change it, but that would be not constructive. This sign of modernizing the customs union would open the door for many other reform agendas again on both sides. So that would be, this is a very ambitious signal, but that would be in the spirit of Walter Hallstein and the idea of 1963 to bring together what belongs together, in his words. That would be a fantastic political step, in my view.
And besides, it's also in the spirit of Helmut Kohl. He said also that Turkey, when they part of Europe, he also declared that in Bonn at the parliament, you know. So, I mean, symbolic gestures are of course very important, but if you look at the relations, then I think, I mean, was the last question, but just allow me to make a short statement. But I would say that especially the Turkey's strategy to when the relations with the European Union institutions were not the best. Turkey has developed this strategy to have the bilateral relations with critical countries of the European Union. This could also create some kind of a dynamic, or when, for example, the defense cooperation in Italy, in Spain, with Poland and Romania, the trilateral economic and security dialogue of Turkey, and so on. I think these on the not on the macro, on the regional, I would say, level playing field for Turkey and counterparts. This could also create kind of a dynamic, I would say. You know, this is my opinion. Well, okay. And yeah, Professor Yalçın, thank you. If I may try to draw a single thread through what we have heard, the interdependence between Europe and Turkey is not in question. What is in question is whether the institutional framework that governs it will be allowed to fall further behind economic reality or be modernized to match it. The argument, as I understand it, is that the window for the latter is open now, but will not be open most probably indefinitely. For those who would like to go deeper, Professor Yalçın's full report, EU-Türkiye Economic Relations at the Crossroads, is available at www.econstance.de, and I really warmly recommend it. My thanks to Professor Yalçın for his time and his clarity, to all of you in the audience for joining us and for your questions, and to the team of SETA Berlin who made this session possible. Thank you and have a nice day. Thank you.